What happens when one of Hollywood's most beloved actors walks onto a daytime talk show stage and ends up in a battle that nobody saw coming? In just 45 seconds, a conversation about movies turned into a moment that would leave the studio audience gasping, the camera crew frozen, and one host facing the consequences of pushing a guest way too far. This is the story of how a simple interview became the most talked about television moment of the year. Harrison Ford walked onto the set of The View on what seemed like an ordinary Tuesday morning. The studio audience erupted in applause as he made his way to the guest chair, that familiar half smile on his face, the one that had made him famous for decades. He was there to talk about his latest project. Nothing controversial, nothing complicated. Just another stop on the promotional tour that comes with being one of the biggest names in entertainment. The panel was in full force that day. Whoopi Goldberg sat at the head of the table. Sarah Haynes and Alyssa Farah Griffin were positioned on one side, while Joy Behar and Sunny Hostin rounded out the group on the other. The energy was typical for the show. Lots of chatter, lots of opinions, the kind of dynamic that made The View what it was. The interview started off smoothly enough. Whoopi kicked things off with the usual pleasantries, asking Harrison about how he was doing, making small talk about the weather, the kind of warm-up questions that every talk show starts with. Harrison responded with his characteristic brevity, polite, but not overly enthusiastic. He had done thousands of these interviews over his career. He knew the routine. Sarah asked about the new project, and Harrison dove into it, talking about the character he was playing, the director he was working with, the locations where they filmed. The audience seemed engaged, leaning forward in their seats, happy to hear him speak. This was what they came for, after all, to see a legend in person, to hear stories from someone who had been part of their lives through countless films. Then, Sunny Hostin decided to take the conversation in a different direction. "You know, Harrison," Sunny began, her tone shifting slightly, "I think it is interesting that you have built this entire career playing these heroic characters, these larger-than-life figures. But in real life, you have been pretty quiet about social issues. Some might say you have stayed silent when your voice could have made a real difference." The studio went quiet for a moment. It was not a question. It was an accusation wrapped in polite words. Harrison's expression did not change, but there was a slight pause before he responded. "I think my job is to entertain people," Harrison said calmly. "I have never believed that being an actor means I have to tell people what to think about every issue under the sun. People are smart enough to form their own opinions." Sunny leaned forward, clearly not satisfied with that answer. "But do not you think that when you have a platform as big as yours, you have a responsibility to use it? I mean, silence can be complicity, right?" Joy Behar jumped in, trying to lighten the mood. "Well, I think Harrison has always let his work speak for itself, and that is not a bad thing." But Sunny was not backing down. "I just think it is convenient, you know? You get to enjoy all the benefits of fame, all the money, all the adoration, but you do not want to deal with the messy parts. You do not want to take a stand when it might cost you something." Harrison's jaw tightened slightly. "I have taken plenty of stands in my life. I just do not feel the need to announce every single one of them on social media or in interviews. Some of us believe in doing things quietly, without making it a performance." The tension was building now. You could feel it in the room. The audience members were shifting in their seats, unsure of where this was going. Alyssa tried to step in, asking a question about Harrison's preparation for his role, clearly trying to steer the conversation back to safer ground. But Sunny was not done. "See, that is what I am talking about," Sunny continued, her voice rising slightly. "That attitude right there. This idea that you are somehow above it all, that you do not need to engage because you are Harrison Ford. It comes across as arrogant, honestly. It comes across as someone who has been so insulated by privilege that you cannot even see how out of touch you are." The words hung in the air like a bomb that had just been dropped. Whoopi's eyes widened slightly, and Sarah looked genuinely uncomfortable. This had gone from an interview to something else entirely. Harrison sat back in his chair, his expression still controlled, but his eyes harder now. "You do not know anything about me," he said quietly. "You do not know what I have done, who I have helped, what I believe in. You are sitting here making assumptions based on what? The fact that I do not tweet about every cause that comes along? The fact that I value privacy?" Sunny shook her head. "I am making observations based on your public record, based on the fact that during critical moments in our history, you have been nowhere to be found. And now, you come on here, and you want us to celebrate you, to fawn over you, just because you are famous." Joy tried again to intervene. "Okay, maybe we should take a step back here." But Harrison was leaning forward now, his voice still measured, but with an edge to it. "I came here to talk about a film, to talk about the work that dozens of people put their hearts into. I did not come here to be lectured by someone who thinks they have figured out everything about me based on what they read online." Sunny laughed, but it was not a friendly laugh. It was dismissive, almost mocking. "Oh, so now I am just someone who reads things online? That is rich, coming from someone who has spent his entire career playing make-believe while the rest of us deal with real problems." That was the moment. That was when something shifted in Harrison's face. The politeness, the professional veneer, it all dropped away for just a second, and what was left was genuine anger. "Playing make-believe," Harrison repeated slowly. "You are sitting here on a talk show, getting paid to give your opinions about things, and you want to talk about what is real? You want to talk about dealing with real problems?" Alyssa jumped in, her voice nervous. "I think maybe we are all getting a little heated here. Let us just take a breath." But the train had left the station. Sunny was not backing down, and neither was Harrison. "Yes, playing make-believe," Sunny doubled down. "You live in a bubble. You have lived in a bubble your entire life. You have no idea what it is like for regular people, for people who actually have to worry about things, who cannot just fly off to their ranch or their private island when things get tough." Harrison stood up. Not quickly, not dramatically, but deliberately. He carefully removed the small microphone that had been clipped to his collar and set it down on the table in front of him. "I do not have to sit here and listen to this," he said, his voice quiet but firm. Whoopi finally found her voice, holding up her hands. "Harrison, come on, let us just talk this out." But Harrison was already turning away from the table. "No," he said simply. "I came here as a professional, to do a job, to talk about work that I am proud of. I did not come here to be insulted by someone who has decided that she knows everything about me, about my life, about what I believe." Sunny was not done, though. Even as Harrison was walking away, she kept going. "This is exactly what I am talking about. The minute someone challenges you, the minute someone asks you to be accountable, you run away. You walk off. Because you are so used to everyone treating you like you are special, like you are above criticism." Harrison stopped. He turned back around, and for a moment, it looked like he might say something else. The cameras were still rolling. The audience was dead silent. Sarah had her hand over her mouth. Joy was looking down at the table. Alyssa seemed frozen. "You want to know what I think?" Harrison said, his voice carrying across the studio. "I think you are sitting up there on your high horse, throwing accusations around, because it makes you feel important. It makes you feel powerful. But you know what? You do not know me. You do not know my life. And honestly, I do not care what you think." Sunny stood up now too, matching his energy. "And I do not care that you are Harrison Ford. I do not care how many movies you have made, or how many fans you have. That does not give you a pass. That does not mean you get to coast through life without ever taking a real stand on anything that matters. A real stand, Harrison repeated, shaking his head. You want to know about taking a real stand? I have been flying rescue missions for years. I have used my own plane, my own time, my own money to help find lost hikers, to help in emergencies. I do not talk about it. I do not post about it. I just do it. Because that is what you do when you actually care about helping people instead of just talking about it. The revelation seemed to catch Sunny off guard for just a moment, but she recovered quickly. Oh, so now you are going to list your credentials? Now you are going to tell us all the good things you have done? That is convenient timing. Whoopi stood up, trying to regain control of the situation. Okay, everybody, let us just take a moment here. But Harrison was already walking toward the exit. I am done, he said over his shoulder. Good luck with your show. Sarah called out, Harrison, please, we did not mean for this to happen. But he kept walking, his stride purposeful, his shoulders set. The cameras followed him as he moved past the crew members who were standing frozen, unsure of what to do. One of the producers started moving toward him, probably to try to salvage the situation, but Harrison waved her off. Sunny, still standing at the table, called out one more time. This is who you really are, everyone. This is what happens when someone does not bow down, when someone does not worship at the altar of celebrity. They cannot handle it. Harrison stopped at the edge of the set, just before the exit. He did not turn around fully, but he spoke loud enough for everyone to hear. No, this is what happens when someone forgets that being on television does not make you better than anyone else. It does not make you smarter. It does not give you the right to treat people like garbage. And then he was gone, disappearing through the exit, leaving behind a studio full of people who could not quite believe what had just happened. Whoopi slowly sat back down, looking at the other panel members. Well, she said quietly, that was something. Joy shook her head. Sunny, I think maybe you pushed a little too hard there. But Sunny was defiant. I said what needed to be said. I am not going to apologize for holding people accountable. Alyssa spoke up, her voice careful. I think there is a difference between holding someone accountable and attacking them. That felt personal. Sunny turned to her. So you are on his side now? You are going to defend someone who just walked off our show? Sarah interjected, trying to be diplomatic. I do not think anyone is taking sides. I just think we all witnessed something that got out of hand, on both sides. The audience was still silent, watching the panel navigate the aftermath. Whoopi tried to move forward, to transition to something else, anything else, but the energy in the room had completely changed. There was no recovering from what had just happened. Backstage, crew, members were whispering to each other, already knowing that this moment would be everywhere within the hour. The producers were on their phones, probably already dealing with the fallout, trying to figure out how to handle the situation from a public relations standpoint. Back at the table, Sunny was still defending herself, still insisting that she had done nothing wrong, that Harrison was the one who had overreacted, who could not handle basic questions. Joy was pushing back gently, suggesting that maybe the approach could have been different. Alyssa was nodding along with Joy, clearly uncomfortable with how everything had unfolded. Sarah tried to offer a middle ground. I think we can all agree that this was an unexpected turn. Maybe we can learn from it. But Sunny was having none of it. Learn what? That we should treat celebrities with kid gloves? That we should not ask tough questions because they might not like it? Whoopi, clearly exhausted by the whole thing, held up her hand. The question is not whether we ask tough questions. The question is how we ask them, and whether we are actually trying to have a conversation or just trying to make a point. The cameras were still rolling, capturing every moment of the panel's attempt to process what had just occurred. The show had to go on. They had to fill the rest of the time slot. But everyone knew that nothing else that happened for the rest of the hour would matter. The only thing anyone would remember, The only thing anyone would talk about was Harrison Ford walking off the set after a confrontation that had spiraled completely out of control. In the audience, people were pulling out their phones, already texting friends, already posting about what they had just witnessed live. Some were defending Harrison, saying that Sunny had been completely out of line, that she had ambushed him with accusations instead of having a real conversation. Others were supporting Sunny, saying that celebrities needed to be challenged, that they should not be able to just coast on their fame without being asked difficult questions. The divide was immediate and stark, and it was only going to grow wider as the clips spread across the internet. On the set, the panel was trying to move forward, but the tension was still palpable. Every word felt heavy. Every transition felt forced. Whoopi was doing her best to steer the ship, but even she seemed shaken by what had transpired. Joy kept glancing at Sunny, clearly concerned about how this was going to be perceived. Alyssa was quieter than usual, probably running through the incident in her mind, thinking about her own role in it, or lack thereof. Sarah tried to bring up the next topic, something light, something easy, but it fell flat. How could they talk about anything else after what had just happened? How could they pretend that everything was normal when one of the biggest stars in Hollywood had just walked off their show, clearly angry, clearly done with the entire situation? Sunny, for her part, seemed to be doubling down on her position, even as the other panel members were clearly second-guessing the whole thing. She kept insisting that she had asked legitimate questions, that Harrison's reaction proved her point about celebrities being out of touch and unable to handle criticism. But even as she said these things, there was a defensiveness in her tone that suggested maybe, just maybe, she was starting to realize that this had not gone the way she had intended, that perhaps she had crossed a line, had let her own desire to make a point override the basic courtesy that should exist between an interviewer and a guest. The show eventually ended, the cameras stopped rolling, and the studio audience filed out, already animatedly discussing what they had seen. The panel members dispersed, with Sunny heading in one direction and the others clustering together, their body language suggesting they had plenty to talk about once they were away from the microphones and cameras. Harrison Ford, meanwhile, was already long gone from the building, probably sitting in a car, heading back to wherever he was staying, likely relieved to be away from the whole mess. He had walked into that studio expecting a routine interview, a simple promotional appearance, and had instead found himself in a confrontation that had required him to defend not just his choices, but his entire character. And for what? For not being vocal enough on social media. For not making his private charitable work public. For having the audacity to believe that he could live his life and do his work without constantly performing his values for public consumption. The whole thing had escalated so quickly, had gone from 0 to 100 in what felt like seconds. One moment they were talking about movies, and the next moment accusations were flying, tempers were flaring, and a guest was walking off the set. It was the kind of moment that would be dissected endlessly, analyzed from every angle, debated on other talk shows and in online forums and at dinner tables across the country. People would have strong opinions about who was right and who was wrong, about whether Sunny had been justified in her approach or whether she had been unnecessarily hostile, about whether Harrison had overreacted or whether he had simply stood up for himself in the face of unfair treatment. But in that moment, on that set, none of that mattered. What mattered was that a conversation had turned into a conflict, that a promotional interview had become a confrontation, and that one of the most famous actors in the world had decided that he would rather walk away than continue to engage with someone who seemed determined to paint him in the worst possible light. The silence that filled the studio after Harrison left was heavy and uncomfortable. It was the silence of people realizing that they had just witnessed something significant, something that would have consequences, something that could not be taken back or smoothed over with a quick apology or a clever transition. Whoopi had tried to maintain control, to be the voice of reason, but even she had been unable to prevent the situation from spiraling. Joy had attempted to inject some levity to diffuse the tension, but her efforts had been too little too late. Alyssa and Sarah had been largely sidelined, watching the confrontation unfold without being able to effectively intervene. And Sunny, the catalyst for the entire incident, was left standing at the table, defending her actions even as it became increasingly clear that she had misjudged the situation, had pushed too hard, had let her own agenda override the basic principles of respectful discourse. The clip would be everywhere, within hours. People would watch it, rewatch it, slow it down to catch every facial expression, every word, every moment of tension. They would create memes, write think pieces, argue in comment sections. Some would praise Harrison for standing his ground, for refusing to be bullied or lectured. Others would criticize him for being thin-skinned, for not being able to handle tough questions from a journalist. But those who were actually in that studio, who felt the energy shift, who watched the conversation deteriorate in real time, they would know the truth. They would know that this was not about tough questions or accountability or holding celebrities to a higher standard. This was about one person deciding to use their platform to attack another person, to make assumptions about their character, to publicly shame them for not living up to an arbitrary standard that they themselves had created. And Harrison Ford, a man who had spent decades in the public eye, who had navigated countless interviews and press junkets and promotional tours, had finally reached his limit. Had decided that being polite and professional did not mean he had to sit there and accept being treated with disrespect. Had chosen to walk away rather than continue to engage with someone who was clearly not interested in having an actual conversation, but was instead determined to prove a point at his expense. The moment when he stood up and removed his microphone would be replayed endlessly. The look on his face, that mixture of disappointment and anger and resignation, would become iconic. His parting words, delivered with quiet intensity as he walked away, would be quoted and requoted, analyzed and debated. And through it all, the central question would remain: when did holding someone accountable become indistinguishable from attacking them? When did asking tough questions become an excuse for rudeness and hostility? When did being a journalist or a television host start to mean that basic respect and courtesy no longer applied? These were the questions that would linger long after the immediate controversy died down, long after the hot takes had been published, and the social media. Storm had moved on to the next outrage, because what had happened on that View set was not just about Harrison Ford and Sunny Hostin. It was about the broader culture of discourse, about how we talk to each other, about the line between challenging someone and attacking them. Harrison had drawn his line. He had decided that his dignity and self-respect were worth more than any promotional opportunity, any publicity, any chance to reach an audience. He had walked away, and in doing so, had made a statement that was perhaps more powerful than anything he could have said if he had stayed in that chair and continued to argue. Because sometimes walking away is not about running from a fight. Sometimes it is about refusing to participate in something that has become toxic and unproductive. Sometimes it is about recognizing that continuing to engage is only going to make things worse, is only going to give more fuel to someone who is determined to misunderstand you, to misrepresent you, to use you as a vehicle for their own agenda. The View had invited Harrison Ford to talk about his work, to share stories from his career, to connect with an audience that had loved him for decades. Instead, they had given him a lecture, a series of accusations, and a host who seemed more interested in scoring points than in having a meaningful conversation. And Harrison, veteran of countless interviews, reader of thousands of scripts, player of heroes and anti-heroes and everything in between, had recognized the script he was being handed in that moment. He had seen where the conversation was going, had understood that nothing he said was going to change Sunny's mind, or satisfy her apparent need to cast him as the villain in her narrative. So he had done the only thing that made sense. he had declined to play the part. He had walked off the set, out of the studio, away from the cameras and the accusations and the performative outrage. He had chosen himself, chosen his peace, chosen to maintain his dignity rather than continue to subject himself to treatment that he did not deserve and had not earned. And in that choice, in that moment of walking away, Harrison Ford had given the audience and the viewers at home something to think about. Something beyond the immediate drama, beyond the conflict, beyond the viral clip that would dominate the news cycle for the next few days. He had reminded everyone that being a public figure does not mean you forfeit the right to be treated with basic human respect, that having a platform does not obligate you to accept abuse or hostility, that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply refuse to participate in something that has become ugly and destructive. The View would go on, the show would continue, other guests would come and go, but that moment, that confrontation, that walk-off, it would remain. A reminder of what happens when the line between challenging and attacking gets blurred, when the desire to make a point overrides the basic courtesy that should exist between people, when someone finally says enough is enough and chooses themselves over the show.